They stood up at the same time. Chairs moved. Laptops closed. No one looked at me. I was halfway through slide 12 when the first one reached the door. By slide 13, the entire executive team was gone. No explanation, no apology, just a quiet, coordinated exit that felt rehearsed. The screen behind me kept moving. My voice did not. I remember thinking I must have missed something, an email, a change, a signal everyone else understood. But then I saw it, the one thing they forgot to take with them. A document still open on the shared system. Time stamped. Locked. Not meant for me. That was when I stopped presenting and decided to call one person. I was not the kind of person people remembered after meetings. Not because I did not speak, but because when I did, it was usually after everyone else had finished. By then, decisions had already taken shape. My role was to confirm them, not influence them. I worked in strategic analytics. That was the formal name. In practice, it meant I translated numbers into something executives could repeat with confidence. Forecasts, risk models, long-term projections, things that looked clean when presented, even if they were built from uncertainty. I was careful with my work. I checked everything twice, sometimes 3 times. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I had learned early that errors stayed attached to names longer than accuracy did. Most people in the company operated differently. They spoke quickly. They filled silence. They adjusted their opinions in real time depending on who was in the room. I did not do that. I listened. I documented. I remembered. That was enough to be trusted with the work. It was not enough to be included in the decisions. There were meetings I prepared for but was not invited to. Slides I created that were presented by someone else. Conversations that referenced my analysis without mentioning where it came from. At first, I thought that was temporary, something that would change as I proved consistency. Over time, I understood it was structural. Still, I stayed. Because the system, for all its limitations, had one quality I respected. It recorded everything. Every file had a history. Every change left a trace. Every decision, no matter how informal it seemed, passed through something measurable. That mattered to me. It meant that even when recognition was absent, accuracy remained somewhere. Most days followed the same pattern. I arrived early before the office filled with movement. The quiet helped. It allowed me to review overnight data updates without interruption. I preferred those hours, the ones where nothing needed to be explained. By mid-morning, messages would begin, requests for clarification, small adjustments, sometimes entire revisions framed as minor edits. I rarely pushed back. Not because I agreed, but because I understood timing. There were moments where resistance changed outcomes, and there were moments where it only changed perception. I waited for the first kind. The project that led to the presentation began without announcement. It started as a request, routine, almost forgettable. A senior director asked for a long-term risk assessment tied to a potential expansion. The scope was broad, but not unusual. I built the model the way I always did, layer by layer. Market variables, operational constraints, external dependencies. I did not assume outcomes. I mapped probabilities. As the weeks passed, the request expanded. More data, more scenarios, additional sensitivity testing. That was the first indication it mattered. Work like that does not grow unless someone higher up is paying attention. Names started appearing on email threads that had not been there before. Vice presidents. Then, eventually, members of the executive team. Their messages were brief, focused. They did not ask questions, they gave direction. Refine this range. Adjust for external volatility. Present in simplified terms. I followed the instructions, but I kept copies of every version, not out of suspicion, just habit. By the second month, the analysis had become central to something larger. I could see it in the way deadlines tightened and language shifted. This was no longer exploratory, it was preparatory. Still, no one explained the full context. That was normal. Information moved in layers, and I was not positioned at the top. Then the calendar invite arrived. It was short. No description beyond a title that matched the project name. The attendees list was what made me stop. Every executive, not representatives, not delegates, all of them. For a moment, I thought it might have been sent in error, that I was included as a placeholder or by mistake. I checked the details again. The time. The room, the version of the file attached. It was mine. No intermediary. No presenter assigned above me, just me. I did not tell anyone about it, not immediately. Instead, I reviewed the entire analysis again from the beginning, every assumption, every conclusion. I looked for weaknesses, not because I expected to be challenged, but because I knew that if I was, it would not be forgiving. In the days leading up to the meeting, small interactions shifted. Colleagues who usually spoke over me paused slightly longer before responding. One of them asked, casually, if I was ready for the room. I did not ask what that meant. Another offered to help position the narrative, which I declined, not directly. I just said I preferred to present the data as it was. They did not insist. That was unusual. The morning of the presentation, I arrived earlier than usual. The office was still quiet, but it felt different. Not empty, just contained. I opened the final version of the presentation and moved through each slide slowly. The numbers were stable. The conclusions were consistent with the model. Nothing had changed overnight, at least nothing visible. When it was time, I gathered my notes, though I knew I would not need them, and walked to the boardroom. The door was already open. Inside, everything was set, chairs aligned, screens active, water placed evenly along the table. No one was speaking. They were all there, seated, waiting. And for a moment, just before I stepped in, I noticed how quiet the room was, not attentive, not focused, just quiet in a way that did not feel neutral. I took my seat anyway. The first change was small enough to ignore. It came through as a calendar update late in the evening. The presentation time shifted by 30 minutes. No explanation, no note attached, just a quiet adjustment that most people would not question. I noticed it because I tracked everything tied to that meeting. Time changes affect preparation. Preparation affects delivery. That was how I understood it. The next morning, I checked the attendee list again. 2 names were gone. They were not minor participants. Both had been involved in earlier discussions, mid-level executives who had asked detailed questions about the model. Their absence did not make sense. I waited for an update explaining the change. Nothing came. Instead, a revised email thread appeared in my inbox. Same subject line, same attachments. But the distribution list was narrower, more controlled. I read through it carefully. The language had shifted, not dramatically, just enough to change the tone. Words like risk exposure had been replaced with managed variability. Uncertainty became projected flexibility. The meaning was still there, but it had been softened. I assumed it was a communication preference. Executives often adjusted language to fit broader narratives. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that the changes appeared inside my report. I opened the file directly from the system. The structure was mine. The formatting was mine. But sections had been edited, not commented, not tracked. Edited, I checked the version history. There were entries I did not recognize, late-night access, multiple revisions, different user credentials. I paused on one of the timestamps. It was from a time I knew I had not been working. That by itself meant nothing. Other people had access to shared files, but they usually left comments, or at least indications of review. These changes were clean, integrated, as if they had always been there. I read through the modified sections again, this time more slowly. Certain risk thresholds had been adjusted upward, not enough to appear incorrect, but enough to delay projected impact timelines. Dependencies that I had flagged as critical were now categorized as monitoring points. The conclusions still followed logically, but from a different starting point. I closed the document and reopened my local copy. The differences were clear. Side by side, they told two versions of the same story. One was cautious, the other was controlled. I did not assume intent, not yet. Instead, I sent a message to the senior director who had initiated the project. I kept it simple, asked if the changes were part of a broader revision. The response came later than usual. Brief, neutral. Yes, minor adjustments for alignment, nothing substantive. I read it twice. There was no attachment, no reference to specific sections, just a general reassurance. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I checked the system logs again. The edits had been made by someone above the director's level. That detail was not included in the reply. Later that day, I crossed paths with one of the removed attendees. It was unplanned. A hallway conversation that began with something unrelated. I asked casually if they would still be attending the presentation. They hesitated, not long, just enough to register. "I think they're keeping that one tight," they said. No explanation, no follow-up. I nodded and let the conversation end there. Back at my desk, I reviewed the file again. This time, I focused on the numbers. They were still accurate. No data had been fabricated. No calculations were wrong. But the interpretation, the framing, had shifted in a way that directed conclusions toward a specific outcome. I opened the access history once more. More entries had appeared. Different names now. Same pattern. Late hours, direct edits, no comments. I began documenting everything separately, not because I believed something was wrong, but because I could no longer confirm that everything was right. That distinction mattered. The next morning, I arrived to find another change. My presentation file had been opened overnight. That, by itself, was not unusual. But the access came from an account that did not belong to anyone on the project team. I checked the permissions. That account did not need access. There were no recorded edits, just an open and close. I stared at the timestamp for a long time, trying to place it within a normal explanation. There usually was one, a misclick, a system sync, an automated process, but none of those matched the pattern. This was deliberate access. Quiet, direct, and unnecessary. I closed the log and returned to the presentation. Slide 12, the one covering long-term exposure, looked unchanged. But I read it again anyway, carefully, as if the meaning might shift if I looked at it long enough. By the time I finished, the discomfort had settled into something more defined. Not certainty, not accusation, just a quiet awareness that the work I was preparing to present was no longer entirely mine. And whatever it had become, I had not been told. I saved a copy of the original file, not on the shared system, somewhere else. The pattern did not announce itself. It repeated. That was how I recognized it. Over the next 2 days, I stopped looking for single explanations and started comparing sequences. Edits, messages, access logs, individually they could be explained. Together, they formed something more consistent. Every adjustment to my report followed the same direction. Not random refinement, not clarification, alignment. I began mapping the changes against previous executive briefings. Notes I had taken during meetings I was not meant to speak in. Phrases that had been repeated often enough to feel intentional. Controlled exposure, managed rollout, contained risk. Those exact phrases had started appearing inside my analysis. Not similar language, exact. I searched my original drafts. They were not there. I opened one of the internal briefing summaries from the previous month. It had been circulated to a limited group, but I had access because I was supporting the data behind it. The language matched, line for line in some cases. I did not move immediately. Instead, I cross-referenced timestamps. The briefing had happened before the edits. That meant the narrative existed first. The analysis had been adjusted to fit it. I sat with that for a while, not reacting, just confirming. Later that afternoon, I was invited to a smaller meeting. No formal agenda, just a pre-alignment discussion. There were 5 people in the room, all at levels above mine. I took a seat at the end of the table. The conversation had already started. They were discussing outcomes, not possibilities. One of them referenced the model's confirmation of a timeline I had not finalized. I listened carefully. The numbers they quoted were close to mine, but not exact. They reflected the modified version, not the original. I waited for a pause. There was one eventually. I spoke once, quietly. I haven't confirmed that timeline yet. The room did not shift. No one reacted immediately. Then one of them responded without looking at me. It's within acceptable range. The conversation continued. As if my input had been processed and set aside, I did not repeat myself. Instead, I noted the phrasing. Acceptable range. Not accurate, not confirmed. Acceptable. After the meeting, one of the mid-level managers approached me. They had been present but had not spoken much. Don't get stuck in the details, they said. Their tone was not dismissive, it was careful. They're looking at the bigger picture. I nodded. I understood the message, not the words, the message. Later that evening, I returned to the system. I accessed the restricted files linked to my project. I did not have permission to open them, but I could see their existence. File names. Modification dates, access frequency. There were more of them than before, and they were active. I checked the access logs again. The same names appeared, repeatedly, always outside normal hours, always in sequence. One account would access the file, then another, then a third. A chain, coordinated. I documented the pattern, carefully, without labeling it, just recording. The next morning, I received a message, short, direct, from someone I had not interacted with before at that level. Ensure presentation stays focused on strategic outcomes. No greeting, no signature beyond the name. I read it once, then again. The instruction was clear, not what to present, what to emphasize. I opened my slides. The structure was still mine. But now I could see where the pressure points were, where interpretation could be guided without altering the numbers, where conclusions could be suggested without being stated. I adjusted nothing, but I marked those sections mentally. Later that day, I attempted to clarify one point in a follow-up meeting. It was smaller, less formal. I chose a moment where the conversation slowed. The dependency in Phase 2 still carries unresolved risk, I said. One of the executives interrupted before I finished. We've accounted for that. I waited. There was no explanation, no reference, just the statement. Another voice added, it's already been addressed in the revised model. I did not respond. Because I knew that was not accurate. Not in the model I had built, but possibly in the one they were using. The distinction mattered, but there was no space to explain it. The conversation moved on. After the meeting, no one followed up. No one asked for clarification. It was as if the inconsistency did not exist, or did not need to. That was when the suspicion settled into something more stable. Not doubt, not confusion, recognition. The presentation was not a point of decision. It was a step in a process that had already moved forward, and my role in it was not to determine the outcome, but to support it. I returned to my desk and opened the version history one more time. There was a new entry, recent, a file I had not seen before, restricted, linked directly to my project. I could not open it, but I could see the title. It included the word final. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the system, without trying to access it again. Because at that point, I understood enough to know that whatever was happening was no longer being hidden from me, just not explained. I chose my words carefully the next time I raised it, not because I was unsure, but because I understood how easily certainty could be reframed as overreaction. The opportunity came during a scheduled review, smaller group, fewer voices, the kind of setting where details were usually allowed to exist. I waited until the discussion narrowed to the model. Then I spoke. "I've noticed some structural changes in the analysis that I didn't implement," I said. "I want to make sure I understand how those adjustments are being applied." There was a pause, not long, just enough to acknowledge that something had been said. One of the executives leaned back slightly. "All updates have been aligned with leadership direction," they replied. Their tone was even, neutral, not defensive, not open. I nodded. "I understand," I said. "I just want to confirm that the current version reflects the original risk thresholds." Another pause, this one longer. A different executive responded. "You may be too close to the data." The sentence was delivered calmly, without emphasis, as if it were a simple observation. I did not respond immediately, not because I agreed, but because I recognized the shift. The question had been redirected, not answered. "The broader context matters here," they continued. "We're looking at strategic positioning, not just isolated variables." I kept my voice level. "The variables define the positioning." No one acknowledged that. Instead, the conversation moved, not abruptly, smoothly, as if my input had been absorbed and filed away under something less relevant. The meeting ended without resolution. No follow-up, no clarification, just a quiet continuation of something I was no longer part of. After that, the distance became more visible. Invitations stopped arriving, not all at once. Gradually, meetings I had been included in before continued without me. Summaries were shorter, less detailed. Conversations happened in smaller circles. I was still assigned work, still expected to deliver, but no longer included in the discussions that shaped it. One afternoon, I approached the senior director again, not to challenge, just to understand. "The version of the model currently being referenced doesn't match the one I built," I said. "I want to make sure I'm supporting the correct framework." They looked at me for a moment, longer than usual. Then they smiled. It was controlled. "You're focusing on the wrong layer," they said. I waited. "The leadership team has already integrated the necessary adjustments," they continued. "Your role is to support the narrative." There was no hesitation in the phrasing, no ambiguity. I did not respond, because the statement was clear, not an explanation, an instruction. I returned to my desk and opened the system again. This time, I reviewed everything from the beginning, every version, every edit, every access point, not looking for mistakes, looking for consistency. It was there, just not where it should have been. The changes were not random. They followed a pattern of intent, but that intent was never documented directly, only implied through outcome. Later that day, I received feedback on the presentation. It came through as comments on the slides. Refined tone. Reduce emphasis on uncertainty. Highlight opportunity. None of the comments addressed accuracy, only perception. I made the changes, not to the data, to the wording. I adjusted phrasing, reordered sections, softened conclusions, but I kept a separate version. Unchanged, stored outside the shared system, that became routine. 2 versions of everything, one visible, one intact. The next interaction was more direct. It happened in passing. A brief conversation near the elevators. One of the executives stopped beside me. "You're doing good work," they said. I nodded. "Just don't overcomplicate it." There was no context, no reference, but the meaning was clear. Do not question the direction. I watched them walk away without responding. That night, I reviewed the access logs again. There was a discrepancy. A verbal claim made earlier that day did not match the recorded activity. An executive had stated that no further edits had been made. The system showed otherwise. Multiple entries. After the meeting, after the statement, I documented it. Carefully, time, user, file, no interpretation, just record. At that point, the pattern had stabilized, not in my favor, but in clarity. I was no longer uncertain about what was happening, only about how far it extended. The final confirmation came quietly. Another message, short, from a different executive. Ensure consistency with previously shared narrative. I read it once, then closed it. There was nothing left to clarify. The work I was doing and the work being presented were no longer the same. And the difference was not being corrected. It was being maintained, intentionally. I did not respond to the message. Instead, I opened the original version of the presentation, the one that had not been altered, and I read it from beginning to end, slowly, as if committing it to memory, because I understood something then that no one had said directly. Accuracy was no longer the priority. Alignment was, and I was expected to choose between them without being told that a choice existed. The system did not resist access. It just delayed it. That was something I had learned over time. Permissions were rarely absolute. They shifted based on context, timing, and pathways. What could not be opened directly could sometimes be reached indirectly. I did not force it. I waited. Late in the evening, when activity dropped and the network quieted, I retraced the structure of the project folders. Not searching randomly, following the logic of how documents were usually organized when they were not meant to be found quickly. Parent directories, archived threads, linked references. Eventually, I reached a file that was not restricted, at least not fully. It was labeled as a summary, not the model, not the presentation, something adjacent. I opened it. At first, it looked familiar. Sections mirrored my own structure, headings I had used, terminology I recognized. But as I read further, the alignment became too precise to be coincidence. This was built from my work, not inspired by it, taken from it. I moved through the document slowly, paragraph by paragraph. Each section carried the same pattern I had already seen: risks softened, dependencies reframed, timelines extended just enough to reduce urgency. But there was something else. Annotations. Not visible in the main text, but embedded in the metadata. Internal notes. They were not meant for presentation. They were meant for coordination. I accessed them through the document properties, short entries, initials instead of full names, but consistent. Align with external commitment. Ensure narrative consistency before board review. Remove emphasis on early-stage volatility. I read each line carefully, not reacting, just absorbing. Because those notes did something the previous evidence had not. They confirmed intent, not inferred, stated. I checked the timestamp. The document had been finalized before my presentation was scheduled. Days before, I sat back slightly, not in surprise, in recognition. The decision had already been made. The presentation was not part of the process. It was part of the sequence. I continued reading. Further down, there was a section labeled Communication Strategy. It outlined how the information would be shared internally and externally. Phased disclosure, controlled messaging, specific points to emphasize, points to avoid. My analysis appeared again fragmented, selected, reassembled to support each stage. Then I reached the part that shifted everything. A reference to external stakeholders, not general. Named. There were commitments listed, timelines attached, agreements implied, all based on the adjusted narrative, not the original. I did not need to cross-check it. The structure made it clear. This was already in motion. I closed the document, then reopened it, not because I doubted what I had seen, but because I needed to confirm it without interpretation. Every line matched, every note consistent. I exported a copy, not through the usual function, through a method that preserved metadata, time stamps, author IDs, revision history, all intact. Then I checked the system logs. The same names appeared again. The same sequence. Access, edit, review, repeated over several days. No gaps, no anomalies, just coordination. There was one more layer, a system log that could not be altered manually. It recorded back-end activity, not just file access, but interaction patterns. I had limited visibility into it, but enough. I filtered by project ID, then by time range. The output was precise, every modification to the key documents, every user involved, every timestamp aligned. I did not recognize all the names, but I recognized enough. And more importantly, I recognized the pattern. This was not a single decision, it was a structured process. Planned, executed, maintained. I sat in silence for a while, not thinking about what to do, just confirming what was already clear. There was no misunderstanding, no miscommunication, no accidental misalignment. This had been built deliberately. My role in it was never to define the outcome, only to support it. I returned to the presentation file, the version I was expected to deliver. It now felt different, not incorrect, but incomplete, curated. I did not change it, I did not correct it, I did not add anything. Because I understood something important, the presentation was not where the truth would be addressed. It was where it would be reinforced. I opened my original version again, the one stored outside the system, unaltered, complete. I reviewed the risk sections, the dependencies, the projections. They were still accurate, still consistent, still unsupported. I saved another copy in a different location, redundant. Then I closed everything, shut down the system, and sat for a moment without moving, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just aware that whatever happened next would not come from what I said in that room. It would come from what had already been done outside of it. After that, the instructions became more precise, not more frequent, just more controlled. They came through different channels, comments on slides, short messages, brief conversations that did not leave records. Each one focused on tone, emphasis, sequencing, never on accuracy. Keep the narrative forward-looking. Minimize early-stage uncertainty. Anchor on long-term stability. I read each one carefully, not to follow them, but to understand how the presentation was being shaped. Outwardly, I complied. I adjusted phrasing, reordered sections, softened transitions between risk and projection. Nothing that could be challenged directly, nothing that changed the numbers, but everything that changed how they would be heard. At the same time, I continued documenting every instruction, every change, every access point, not as a reaction, as a process. I preserved the original files in multiple locations, exported logs, captured system records that showed not just what had changed, but when and by whom. I did not label anything. I did not draw conclusions. I just made sure that nothing could be removed without leaving a gap. The closer the presentation date came, the quieter things became. Fewer messages, shorter meetings, less discussion. It felt less like preparation and more like containment. On the morning of the presentation, I arrived earlier than usual. The building was not empty, but it felt restricted. Movement was limited. Conversations were brief. I went directly to my desk and opened the system one last time. The presentation file was there. Final version, no new edits. I checked the access logs. There had been activity overnight, not on the presentation, on the restricted documents. Multiple entries, same pattern, same sequence, then nothing. I closed the system and gathered my materials. There was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to confirm, only to deliver. The boardroom was already prepared when I arrived, same as before. Chairs aligned, screens active, water placed evenly. The executive team was present, all of them, seated, waiting. No one spoke as I entered. I took my position at the front of the room and connected the presentation. The screen came to life. Slide 1, title, no reaction. I began. My voice was steady, measured, exactly as I had practiced. I moved through the first few slides without interruption. Context, scope, methodology, no questions, no comments, no visible engagement. By slide 5, I noticed something. No one was taking notes. No one was looking at the screen for more than a few seconds at a time. Their attention was elsewhere, not distracted, just not invested. I continued. Slide 8. Initial findings, still nothing, no challenge, no clarification, no acknowledgement. It was not resistance. It was absence. By slide 10, the pattern was clear. They were not there to evaluate the presentation. They were there to observe its completion, or something close to it. I moved to slide 12, long-term exposure. The section where the differences between the original and adjusted narratives were most visible. I paused slightly. Not long enough to be noticed, just enough to register the moment. Then I continued. Midway through the explanation, the first movement happened. A chair shifted. Quiet, deliberate. I did not look up. I kept speaking. Another movement. A laptop closed. Then another. Still no words, no interruption, just small signals of disengagement. I reached the end of the slide, transitioned to the next. That was when the first person stood. No announcement, no apology, just a quiet movement toward the door. I stopped for a fraction of a second, then continued, because stopping would have acknowledged it, and I was not ready to do that. By the time I reached slide 13, 3 more had stood. Same pattern, no eye contact, no explanation, just exit, one by one. In sequence, as if it had been decided, I kept presenting. Not because I believed they were listening, but because the system was still recording. The screen was still active. The file was still open. That mattered more than the room. By slide 14, only 2 remained. They did not look at me. They did not look at the screen. They simply waited until the last line of the slide was spoken. Then they stood and left. The door closed behind them, softly. No sound beyond that. The room was still. The screen remained on. Slide 15 loaded automatically. I did not speak, not immediately. Instead, I stood there for a moment, looking at the empty chairs, not in disbelief, in confirmation. Then I turned back to the screen. The system was still active. The presentation file still open. And in the corner of the interface, something else. A window, minimized but not closed, a document linked to the same project. I had not opened it, I knew that, which meant someone else had, and left it there. I walked back to the console, slowly, not rushing. Not hesitating, just moving with the same pace I had maintained throughout. I expanded the window. The document opened, immediately. No permission barrier, no restriction, just access. The title confirmed it. Final alignment. I read the first line, then the second, then I stopped, because I did not need to read further. Everything I had documented, everything I had suspected was there, not implied, not adjusted, stated. I closed the presentation file, left the document open, and stood there for a moment. In the same silence the room had returned to. Then I reached for my phone. There was no hesitation, no reconsideration. I already knew who to call. Not someone involved, not someone aligned, someone outside the structure, someone who still followed process even when others did not. I selected the name and pressed call. The phone rang longer than I expected, not because the person was unavailable, but because I had never called them directly before. Not like this. When they answered, their voice was neutral. Hello. I did not introduce myself immediately, not out of hesitation, out of precision. I need to report a discrepancy in a finalized executive document, I said. There was a pause, short, measured. Send the reference. No questions, no surprise, just a process. I looked at the screen in front of me. The document was still open, unchanged. I will, I said, but I need to confirm that it will be reviewed independently. Another pause. slightly longer this time. "It will be logged," they replied. "That ensures review." That was enough. I ended the call without adding anything else. No explanation, no context, because the documentation would carry that, not me. I placed the phone down and returned my attention to the screen. The document had not moved. No new edits. No access notifications. It remained exactly as it had been left, as if no one expected it to be found, or no one expected it to matter. I did not close it immediately. Instead, I began the process I had already prepared for, systematically, without deviation. I exported the document using a method that preserved its internal structure, metadata, revision history, embedded notes. Then I cross-referenced it with the logs I had collected. Every entry aligned, every modification matched. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies, just a complete record. I attached the files to a secure channel, not email. Not anything visible within the usual communication flow. A direct submission, time-stamped automatically. Traceable, I included no commentary, no summary, only identifiers, project name, file references, access logs, then I submitted it. The confirmation came instantly, receipt logged. That was the end of my involvement in that step. There was nothing more to add, nothing more to explain. I closed the submission portal and returned to the boardroom. The presentation screen had gone idle. The system had timed out. I reactivated it briefly, just long enough to confirm that the session history had been recorded. It had start time, end time, duration, no interruptions logged, only completion. I did not restart the presentation. There was no audience, no purpose. I shut the system down and gathered my materials, slowly, deliberately, the same way I always did after any meeting, nothing outwardly different, nothing that would signal what had just happened. As I left the room, the hallway was empty. Not unusually so, just quiet. I returned to my desk and sat down, opened my regular workflow, checked routine messages, responded to pending requests. The same pattern, unchanged. No one contacted me about the presentation, no follow-up, no acknowledgement. It was as if it had not occurred, or had occurred exactly as intended. Later that afternoon, I received a message, not about the project, not about the presentation. A standard request for data clarification on an unrelated task. I responded, precisely, without delay, because that was still my role, still my function, still the expectation. The rest of the day passed without interruption. No meetings, no calls, no visible reaction, but the absence itself carried weight. It was too complete, too consistent. The kind of silence that follows coordination, not confusion. I did not check the submission status again. There was no need. The process had started. That was enough. By the time I left the office, nothing had changed on the surface. The same people moved through the same spaces. The same conversations continued. The same structure held, but something had shifted, not externally, internally, in the way I understood my position within it. There was no longer any uncertainty, no remaining doubt about what had happened or what it meant, and more importantly, no expectation that it would be acknowledged. That was the cost, not exposure, not consequence. Absence of recognition. I accepted that, not as a decision, as a condition. The next morning, I returned at the same time, sat at the same desk, opened the same systems. Everything appeared unchanged, until I checked one thing: access permissions. They had not been reduced, not restricted, but adjusted. Slightly, subtly, enough to indicate awareness, without confirmation. I did not react, I did not question it, I simply noted it. Because that was how this worked, nothing direct. Nothing stated, only shifts, signals, consequences that did not need to be explained. I continued working, the same as before, but with one difference. I was no longer trying to understand what was happening. I already did. Now I was waiting to see what the system would do with it. The first sign was not an announcement. It was a request. It appeared in my inbox the following afternoon, flagged, formal but routine in tone. Please provide source verification for data inputs related to project reference. No urgency. No escalation language, just a standard procedural inquiry. I read it once, then again. The sender was not part of the executive team, not part of my department either. They operated separately. Process oversight. I responded within minutes. Attached the original data sets, the unmodified model, the version histories I had already preserved. No explanation. No indication that anything was unusual, just compliance. The response came back quickly. Received, additional clarification may be requested. That was all. Over the next 2 days, similar requests began to appear, not all directed at me. Some I saw indirectly, forwarded threads, system notifications, access requests tied to the same project. Each one small, isolated, procedural, but consistent. They all pointed to the same thing, verification. I continued my work as usual. Attended meetings, delivered updates. Nothing in my schedule changed, but the tone did, subtle at first, then more noticeable. Conversations became more precise, less assumption, more reference. Phrases like "as previously confirmed" began to disappear, replaced by "can you verify or please confirm source?" I did not initiate any of it. I did not reference the submission. I did not connect the patterns outwardly. But internally, the alignment was clear. By the third day, the executive team's presence shifted. Not visibly reduced, but less direct. Meetings were postponed, then rescheduled, then shortened. Some were delegated entirely. Messages that had once come from specific individuals now came from shared channels. Neutral, unattributed, I noticed one more change. Documents that had previously been restricted began to surface. Not fully open, but partially visible. Sections accessible. Enough to review, not enough to edit. I opened one of them, carefully. It was the same final alignment document, but now it included additional annotations. Questions, requests for clarification, marked by different identifiers, not the original authors, a new layer, review, the notes were precise. Confirm basis for adjusted timeline. Provide source for revised risk threshold. Clarify discrepancy between model versions. No conclusions, just questions, but the kind that required answers, traceable ones. I closed the document and returned to my tasks. Later that afternoon, a meeting invitation arrived. Not for a presentation, not for discussion, a review session, attendance required. The list included several names I recognized from the oversight group. Also included 2 members of the executive team, not all, just 2. I accepted the invite. When the meeting began, the structure was different from anything I had seen before. No introductions, no framing, just a sequence of questions. Directed, specific, each tied to documentation, each requiring confirmation. I answered only what was asked, nothing more, no interpretation, no context beyond what the records showed. When a question referenced the modified version of the model, I clarified the distinction. There are multiple versions, I said, the original and the adjusted. No one interrupted. No one redirected. They asked for both. I provided both. The session continued like that, measured, controlled. No confrontation, no accusation, just comparison, line by line, record by record. At one point, one of the executives spoke, briefly. The adjustments were made for strategic alignment. The response from the oversight lead was immediate. Please provide documentation supporting that alignment. There was no answer, not immediately. The meeting moved on, but the gap remained, noted, unresolved. By the end of the session, nothing had been concluded, nothing had been stated directly. But the structure had shifted. Authority was no longer assumed, it was being examined. After the meeting, no one approached me, no follow-up, no acknowledgement. But later that evening, I noticed something. One of the executives who had been most involved was no longer listed on the project, not removed, reassigned, quietly. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. Over the next few days, more adjustments followed. Timelines were revised, external communications delayed. Certain initiatives paused, all framed as routine recalibration. Nothing connected publicly, nothing attributed. But internally, the direction was clear. The narrative had not collapsed, it had been interrupted. And that interruption was enough. I continued working, the same as before, no change in role, no increase in visibility. But when I accessed the system now, the records remained intact, unaltered, unhidden. And for the first time since the project began, no one tried to change them. Nothing was resolved in a way that could be pointed to. There was no final meeting, no statement, no acknowledgement of what had happened or how close it had come to being permanent. The project continued, but differently. Slower, more measured. Language that once moved quickly through approvals now paused. Questions appeared where there had been none, not from me, from others. The structure remained the same on the surface, the same titles, the same roles, but something underneath had shifted, subtly, permanently. The executives were still there, still leading, but more careful, less certain in how conclusions were presented, more aware of what could be traced, what could be checked, what could not be adjusted without record. No one spoke to me about it, not directly. There was no recognition, no quiet thank you, not even indirect acknowledgement, only a change in tone. Meetings I attended became quieter, not in volume, in behavior. When I spoke, no one interrupted, not because my position had changed, but because something else had. The weight of what I said was no longer dismissed automatically, not accepted immediately, just considered. Access shifted too. Gradually, I was included in discussions earlier, not at the end, not after conclusions had already formed, still not central, but no longer excluded. It was enough to notice, not enough to explain. Weeks later, I stood in the same boardroom again. Another presentation, different project, same structure, same seats. This time, no one left. They listened, quietly, without interruption, without reaction, just attention. I moved through the slides the same way I always had, measured, precise, unchanged. When I finished, there was no applause, no visible approval, just a brief pause. Then the next item began, as if nothing unusual had happened. And maybe, to them, it hadn't. I gathered my materials and left the room. The hallway was the same, the building unchanged. Everything continued, as it always had. But I understood something clearly now. The system had not protected me. It had not prevented what happened. It had not corrected it immediately. But it had done one thing. It had recorded it. And in the end, that was enough.